I'm going to go ahead and get us started. We have a lot that we're going to do today. Welcome. I'm Eric Engdahl. I'm president of the Cal Council on Teacher Education, and I'm chair at the Department of Teacher Education at Cal State East Bay, and I'm really grateful to be part of this CEDAR group working on the Critical Collaboration Workshop series. You'll find out more about that as we go along. Welcome again. For those of you who came in, it would be great to go ahead and put your name and institutional affiliation, where you're from, an IHE, a K-12 district in the chat so we know who's there. And then without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Amy.
Hello, everybody. Just a quick overview of our plan for today. So we have our wonderful speaker, Saili Kulkarni, who's going to be sharing with us first. Then we will have a welcome from CEDAR. We have a short panel, and then we'll be orienting you into kind of the work we're hoping will be an ongoing process with as many of you as possible. So we do have some information about a short course in Blackboard. We'll get you oriented to that, and then we'll be moving to some breakout rooms. So just a quick introduction of Saili. I first met Saili when she was an inclusion specialist in Oakland Unified, and I think, Saili, the first time I met you was when you attended a CalTASH conference. And CalTASH is a statewide advocacy group for and with people with disabilities. And since then, I've watched Saili from afar in her advocacy and her work in the field of discrit, which has really established her as a critical emerging scholar in this field. From her time as a teacher to her work in her doctoral program at UW-Madison, and now in teacher education at San Jose State University. She's now an assistant professor in the Department of Special Education at San Jose State. Her background in inclusive and special education and her work on the intersections of ableism and racism position her as the ideal speaker to introduce this critical collaboration series. And we hope through this series to highlight ways in which general and special education might more effectively collaborate to tackle not just the practical day-to-day challenges in the classrooms, but also to address systems of oppression throughout our educational system, with an emphasis on both K-12 systems and teacher preparation. So without further ado, I want to invite Saili.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you to all of you who helped organize this panel, and I appreciate the opportunity to reschedule it. As everyone knows, COVID-19 has made things a little bit more challenging in our daily lives, and there's been a lot of canceling and rescheduling, so I really appreciate, I know how much effort goes into planning. Today I'm going to start by doing a little bit of introduction. We can go to the next slide, that's fine. And then I'll do a little bit of framing and defining some language around racism and ableism and discrits. And then I'm actually going to go ahead and go through the tenets of discrits so that you kind of become more familiarized with what exactly is involved. I'll provide some examples, both from P12 settings in schools, as well as, just outside examples as well. And then I'm hoping that we can kind of engage a little bit in a discussion of how this framework really leads to some anti-racist, anti-ableist practices. And some of my own work has really been looking at, how do we now translate this theory right into practice and practical settings. So hopefully we'll get a chance to look at a couple of things that I've developed, and then, engage with you a little bit in questions and answers about what types of things you're doing in your setting, either the schools or teacher education. So next slide, please. So I always want to start to take a moment and acknowledge and honor, right, the original stewards of the land from which I'm presenting today, and that is the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. It's important that we acknowledge this because, again, we all sit on indigenous land. It's where we live, it's where we work, it's where many of our institutions are. And it's also important to note because of the sacrifices that our ancestors and those who came before us are making to make this possible for us. And I'm not doing that sort of as a, like, oh, this is the slide, you know, that I have to show, but more because this is, you know, a place of privilege for many of us, right? Many of us are direct beneficiaries or indirectly benefiting from the fact that we, you know, we sit on this land. And below you'll see, what I try to do is I provide image descriptions whenever I do try to provide images in this PowerPoint. And so this set of images is actually the Muwekma people across 5 historical scenes, and it comes from the San Francisco Muwekma Ohlone Tribes website. Next slide, please. And so anytime I do presentations and I do this work, right, you know, typically we think of presentations as very formal, but I always like to provide an opportunity for, you know, participants to get to know me better and to know me sort of more personally. Because I feel like, you know, this is work that is not just, you know, sort of my professional work, but it is also personal to me. And so just briefly, a couple of things about me that you may have not known, right? I think Amy did mention, though, that I did my doctoral work at Wisconsin-Madison. And so you'll see a series of images here, the first of which on the left is with Bucky Badger, who is the mascot of Wisconsin-Madison. And that's me with one of my dissertation committee members. For those of you in higher education, it's Gloria Ladson-Billings. And the second picture is me, you know, graduating when I finished my doctoral program, just really, really excited to be done. It's a long process. And I actually met my husband in grad school, and we actually got married in 2019. We had 3 weddings. You know, our relationship kind of spans 2 cultures. And so we did a wedding in India. In 2019, we did a wedding in Portland, where my family lives, and then we did one in Santa Clara County with the courthouse. So fortunately, this was all before COVID, so we were not prevented from having our weddings. So this was really, we were fortunate to kind of have all of those things happen beforehand. So that's just a little bit about me. We can go to the next slide. And so I say this because what is, I think, really, really important when we're doing this work of education, right, is our positionality and our relationality. And so we need to not only understand what our individual positionings are, so things like social identities, right, your gender, your race, your disability, sexuality, your language dominance, your culture, right, but also what, you know, context you are bringing these identities into, right? What is your contextual positioning? Where are you teaching? Where are you working, right? And then, you know, really thinking about who you are in relationship to that context, right? So Nolan and Mola 2020 kind of offer that this positionality has to take into account those socio-spatial contexts of practice, right? So it's not just about like, oh, who am I and I understand my identities, but how do I actually then think about what those identities look like in the practices that I'm undertaking, right? So thinking about how, you know, I'm in relationship to my context. And so I want you to just take a moment in the chat. You don't have to answer every one of these questions, but think about maybe the answer to one of them. You know, either question 1, you know, what is your individual social positioning? 2, what is your contextual positioning? Or 3, who are you, right, in relationship to your context? So just take a quick moment. You can put it in the chat. And I'll give you my example after, you know, I've heard from some of you. Okay, so we have rural, school, self-contained, largely urban. Similar background and conditions to students. Okay. Thank you. Ed specialist, Hispanic serving institution. So I'm going to go to the next slide so I can actually show you a couple of mine. So here's kind of where the answers to those questions lie for me, right? So I'm going to just share, in the colors that are sort of yellow and orange hues, you'll see on the left side some of my social identities, right? So I identify as a woman, right? So my pronouns are she, her, hers. I identify as somebody who has invisible disabilities, so somebody who identifies as disabled. I identify as a woman of color of South Asian heritage, heterosexual, and have always lived in moderate to high socioeconomic statuses, okay? And then on the right side, you're going to see from the California State University's dashboard, a little bit of information about the context in which I teach, okay? So San Jose State in the special education department in which I work with teachers is, the majority of students identify, 38%, as you can see in the purple, identify as Hispanic or Latino. The next largest category is white students, and then the third largest category is the other, and then Asian American or Asian. And so this just kind of gives you an idea of, what is my relationship, right, to the students with whom I work, and constantly having to kind of negotiate or think about that, right? So for instance, I don't identify as Hispanic or Latino. So what are the affordances and constraints, right, of my identities in that space? And so just kind of giving us the opportunity to start by thinking about that, I think, is important. Next slide, please. And I also wanted to kind of think us through some of the anti-racist and anti-ableist language framing that some of which evolves out of Discrit, which I'll go through, and some of which, just kind of is hoping to reframe some of our thinking around the language that we use, right? So to begin with, Erica Miners actually uses this term school to prison nexus. You may have heard the term school to prison pipeline. But the difference here is that school to prison nexus really helps us think about, again, a web of punitive threads that lead to criminalization and incarceration in our P-12 system. And so we don't think of pipeline because pipeline suggests linearity, and this is not a linear process through which students ebb and flow through this system. The second term is color evasiveness. So oftentimes we hear the term blind spot, blindness, color blindness, right? And color evasiveness, while not just talking about the metaphor of disability, is actually talking about the avoidance that takes place when discussing things like racism and ableism. However, we use evasiveness because disability is often talked about as this metaphor for weakness or undesirability. And so how can we flip the language or flip the script on some of this language that is inherently ableist, right? So if you look at number 3, anti-ableist language, some of our everyday linguistic microaggressions contribute to ongoing or casual ableism. So for example, oh my God, that's crazy, right? People say that all the time, right? But again, if we think a little more carefully about the term crazy, right, and the reference to people who may have mental or psychiatric disabilities, we have to think about, how it is being casually used in that setting, right? So, words like crazy or idiotic, right, are part of everyday parlance, but it's actually, problematic, right? Or again, highlights that disability as weakness or undesirability. Okay, I also provide on the bottom here a link. So once you have the access to the PowerPoint slides, you'll be able to look through some additional anti-ableist language in the PDF. Next slide, please. One of the things that I always want to make kind of clear about, presentations that I do and also the work that I do is that there are anti-racist commitments that go into this work. And so whenever I'm talking with teachers or I'm working in my classrooms, right, with as a teacher educator, these are the things that are sort of foundational ideas to the work that's being done. The first, and it doesn't seem like a real big deal or something that would be tough to manage, but it is sometimes tough. The first is that racism is real, okay? It is embedded into the fabric of political, social, and cultural institutions. The second is treating everyone equally or avoiding the conversations about race, such as what we talked about with color evasiveness. Is not necessarily, this is again, not a neutral stance. It is that we have to actively work against, right? Color evasiveness. The third is Black Lives Matter, Black Trans Lives Matter, Black Disabled Lives Matter, Black Minds Matter, Black Futures Matter. Okay, again, something that up until maybe a few years ago was not always easy to say in spaces. And then the last is that racism and ableism operate interdependently to multiply marginalize. And this will come back to with the discrete tenets. Next slide, please. So I draw a little bit of my work from abolitionist teaching. So for those of you who are familiar with Bettina Love's work, We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching and the Pursuit of Educational Freedom, the book. And so these 4 quotes from the book actually highlight ableism and racism, as Bettina Love talked about. And it was from some of the early introductory chapters that she more specifically highlights these 2 areas. And so I'm just going to give a quick quote from some of the work that she's provided here. The first is on page 6. She talks about how the American Civil Liberties Union reported that students of color, students with disabilities, and students of color with disabilities are more likely to be funneled into the criminal justice system for behavior that may warrant supportive interventions or a trip to the principal's office, not a criminal record. So this again goes back to what we talked about with the school to prison nexus. Again, that system is, funneling students into a criminal justice system. And these are students of color with disabilities. The next is racial and disability analyses are necessary for dialogues about schools because schools are inherently violent to dark children and children with disabilities. And so these framings are ways of us, again, engaging racism and ableism, and how we can start to understand these things is going to help us to then undo these inherently violent pieces, right, of education and the education system. Next slide, please. So here's a question for you, and you don't have to, come up with an answer for it, but just kind of be thinking about it. What does it mean for our students to really matter in schools? And by that, I mean our students who are multiply marginalized, our students of color with disabilities, and then how can we make sure that they know that they matter? So again, something to just kind of keep in mind. It's something that, again, stems out of this abolitionist teaching work. So thinking about, again, what does it mean for our students to really matter in schools? And how do we make sure that they know, right, that they matter? Okay, next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk to you about the framework, discrete. So discrete has 7 tenets, okay? And again, the basis of these tenets is the idea that racism and ableism circulate interdependently. So around tenet 1, they circulate interdependently to uphold notions of normalcy. And we see this, constantly and in different ways throughout the P12 school system. We see this in teacher education, we see this in education, and even more broadly in society. And so I'm going to go through each of the tenets and just provide you with a little bit of framing and then also some examples. Next slide, please. So tenet 1 talks about how racism and ableism circulate interdependently to hold up notions of normalcy. So these work in tandem in society. We cannot necessarily separate things like race, ability, and disability. Because again, we know, right? We know from schools, we know from the ways that schools operate, right? That students with disabilities who are students of color face much more segregation, are much more separated than their white peers. And in both cases, right? And those who are perceived, right, in schools as deviating from the norm of whiteness, of ability, of able-bodiedness, are always seen as deficient or needing to be fixed. We see these examples when we label students as things like high risk, when we label students with other judgmental disabilities, such as emotionally, behaviorally disturbed. We see this when students, certain students, right, are perceived as smart or good, right? And that is often tied to race. Next slide, please. We also see this again with that school to prison nexus, right? And so this is an example from a couple of years ago that showed there were 2 Orlando police officers that arrested a 6-year-old girl. Her name was Kaya Roll, and she had a tantrum in class, and she was arrested for having a tantrum. And this was just a picture of her mother and her being interviewed after the arrest. She claimed that she still had nightmares after that arrest. And again, she threw a tantrum. And she was arrested. She was arrested because she was Black. And at 6 years old, this happens, right? And it is not right. There are cases like this that exist elsewhere. This is not an isolated incident. And we need to understand that this is exactly the racism and ableism operating in tandem, right? This girl, her mother claims, that she had sleep apnea and she had some issues around ADHD. And this may have contributed, to her having a tantrum in class. And so, when we see this, right, we understand that, the school to prison nexus isn't just reserved for secondary settings. It is happening for children as young as 6. Next slide, please. So discrete tenet 2 then troubles that singular notion of identity, right? It's not disability or race or class, it's disability and race and class and gender. And again, the idea is to foreground certain issues have been rendered invisible by other frameworks such as critical race theory, such as the way that we construct disability. So sometimes these things are often invisibilized or left out. But we need to understand that there is this notion of being multiply marginalized, right, across these different social identities. Next slide, please. So I encourage you to visit this site. It's called the Harriet Tubman Collective. It is a collective of Black, deaf, and disabled activists, community organizers, those striving for radical inclusion. Harriet Tubman had an acquired disability. People don't often know that about her, but a slave owner actually struck her in the head and she actually suffered a TBI as a result of that, including like epileptic seizures and so forth. And it's important, I think, to understand that, she lived that identity, right, at the intersections as a Black female, as a Black person with disabilities. And the project actually seeks to look at those intersectional pieces. They talk about how a lot of our instances where we see police brutality, for instance, are not necessarily just cases where race itself or alone independently is operating. There are cases where people of color with disabilities are also being targeted for police brutality. Next slide, please. So tenet 3 then emphasizes that there's social constructions of race and ability, and yet there are some psychological impacts of having a label or the language around this, right? And so the idea that race and ability are socially constructed, their perceptions of race informing abilities of students in classrooms, and that these are often used to justify how we segregate students based on the fact that it's biological. Those students just are less than, or they are having some sort of internal deficit that needs to be corrected. And so those are often the ways in which we segregate and separate students. Next slide, please. And so this actually comes from a teacher of color with disabilities who I was working with last year, who we worked on a project where we did narratives and was sharing his own experiences of being a special education student. And I'll just read part of the quote. I'm not going to read everything, but it's there for you. It says, "As a student who attended a special education program, I often faced embarrassment, internalized ableism, and shame about disability. As I went to middle school, news came out I was placed in special education from other students who would gossip before school. The majority of my teachers at this school, including my special education teachers, were white. The first time I was able to experience having someone I could relate to was when I met Coach Drake. Coach Drake was a Black male and shared my background." And so there's a couple of different things operating there, right? This embarrassment or shame around disability, right? That is so prevalent for our students who are in special education. And then also this idea of not really having someone to turn to, right? Someone who could be a role model, who could be somebody to support that student as a Black student. Next slide. And then this also comes out of Urban Narratives, which is written by David Connor, which is portraits of students in high school who have learning disabilities, and they're mostly students of color. It says, "They let it slide when you need to spell something. They correct it for you. They don't help you unless you have a test. They don't even know if you can do it yet, and they'll tell you the answers. And when you ask them, can you explain this? They like, I just showed you and whatnot. It's like some of them don't want to be here. Then what are you here for? That's the answer right there. You didn't even show me the problem. In math, they don't give you a chance to do it on your own, to succeed, to see if you know how to work it out." And this is one of the participants of that book who was talking about one of his special education teachers and the ways in which the student was perceived, right, in that space. Next slide, please. So then we also have to consider not just what's happening sort of at the psychological impacts of disability and the interdependence of racism and ableism, right? But the legal and historical aspects of disability and race and how these historical aspects, again, have separately and together denied rights for people of color who are multiply marginalized, okay? And so it considers, again, the legal, the ideological or historical aspects of how this has happened. The belief, again, in that superiority of whiteness. And some of this has been, sort of justified through science, right? The science of craniology, the science of eugenics and phrenology to maintain the inferiority of Blackness. And I actually have a clip, but I think I'll, maybe for the sake of time, we'll come back to it. But it's from the movie Intelligent Lives. So for those of you who haven't seen it, I highly recommend the film, which goes through a little bit of the history of intelligence testing, which has, again, been another way to separate and segregate students of color with disabilities.
And we can also link it on the Blackboard course if we don't have time for it also.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Next slide, please. And this also is another example I would highly recommend. This is from Radiolab. It's called The Miseducation of Larry P. And describes the case Larry P. v. Riles. And again, another example of how intelligence testing was used to segregate Black students. Next slide, please. So tenet 6 looks at whiteness and ability as property gains for people with disabilities as the result of interest convergence of the white middle class. And so, when I thought about this, I was thinking about, for those of you who've, listened to the Nice White Parents podcast, they actually specifically do talk about interest convergence. So for those of you who are not familiar with the term and then kind of what is going on there, this idea, right, that, oh, if it benefits me, then it's okay, right? So this economic benefits to those who claim whiteness and normalcy, and disadvantages for those who cannot claim those statuses. So political interests of particular groups have sometimes been obtained through this interest convergence. And so thinking about how some of our, rights for people with disabilities have also been obtained similarly. Next slide, please. And so this is another example of that, right? This, the faking disability accommodations story that came out in 2019 with some of our celebrities, right? Faking those accommodations so that their students would, do better, right? On their standardized tests, obtain admission to the best schools, right? Another example of, again, that interest convergence and sort of, taking up the supports that are needed by many. Next slide, please. And then the last tenet looks at activism and supports all parts of resistance. So looking at all forms of resistance, activism, work that is in line with communities. And then we also have to acknowledge that some of this work, right, may itself, kind of lend itself to ableism, right? So our, conceptions of like things like sit-ins and marches, right, may leave out people with disabilities. And so it's important to think of activism beyond, what we think of as traditionally those ways of showing, right? So, I'm providing a couple of examples here. If those of you who are, in the higher education institutions, looking at things like citation politics in the work that we do, are we citing disabled scholars of color or people of color in our work? Are we, thinking about who actually holds knowledge, right, in particular spaces? For those of you who are teachers or service providers, how is representation actually being done in your classrooms or in your curriculum? How are we listening to what our students are telling us, like David Connor's quote, right? What are the students actually saying about special education? What are the students saying about their experiences in schools? And then with students, taking opportunities to give them, a chance to be leaders, right, in the classroom. Can students be participating in research in ways in which they're taking leadership or ownership of research? Can they help generate the curriculum or make the lessons, right, rather than passively sit and listen? Next slide, please. And so this is sort of a radical example from one of my recent articles in which one of the teachers of color, who is a special education teacher, actually worked to exit students from special education in his class because he knew that special education, as it says below, right, has bad outcomes for kids of color. And so it's saying, right, that not that, oh, nobody needs services or anything like that, right? It's saying that we know that special education as a system itself needs to radically shift, right? And it has not. And so, what are ways in which we can get students out of that, radically negative system, right? And find ways to engage in new ways. And so that's just an example of that. Next slide, please. And then this is just some examples of materials that map with those tenets of Discrit. This is from a recent article as well. So as you can see, a couple of them I've mentioned, a couple I didn't that I do want to highlight. Leroy Moore's work with Crip Hop Nation, his poetry and his Disabled Art History 101 are just fabulous, fabulous materials, which I highly recommend, especially if you're a teacher, to engage with. The Harriet Tubman Collective, as I said before, David Connor's work. These are all great examples of those intersections of race and ability. Next slide, please. And then this actually is from a recent article that looks at these anti-racist and anti-ableist practices for young learners and for early childhood settings. And so my colleagues and I actually developed these for teachers, service providers, and school leaders as some of the practices that we can take from some of the material that's already out there. And again, using a discrete informed curriculum and discrete informed work to really kind of rethink the ways in which we have framed some of these practices for young learners. So, we use that example of Kaya, right, from before, of how do we, move away from those exclusionary disciplinary practices for young kids of color and young kids with disabilities. Next slide, please. And so I'm just going to end with this quote here, which kind of, I think, highlights, again, this intersection of disability and race. This is from Kia Brown, and it's from Alice Wong's recent book called Disability Visibility, First-Person Stories of the 21st Century. It says, unfortunately, we live in a society that assumes joy is impossible for disabled people, associating disability with only sadness and shame. So my joy, the joy of professional and personal wins, of pop culture and books, of expressing platonic love out loud, is revolutionary in a body like mine. I say this without hyperbole, though fully aware that the thought may confuse, frighten, or anger people. As a Black woman with cerebral palsy, I know what it's like to encounter all three. Next slide, please. And so I know that you will have some time afterwards to kind of engage a little bit with discussion and questions that you may have about this work. And then the last slide that I have on here is just a couple of my recent works, which again have engaged discrit in a couple of these different ways, again, through early childhood, through thinking through some of the curricular pieces, and then, sort of in response to teacher education, in case you're interested in reading a little bit more or want to read a little bit more. And you're also welcome to contact me if, you have other questions or want to engage further. Well, I hope this was informative for you, and I thank you for allowing me to share some of this with you today.
Saili, I just can't thank you enough for providing this really exceptional foundation for all of us. So I guess we want to do like our round of applause. And I want to invite, if anybody has comments or questions, know that although we're short on time to do a large group discussion right now, we will be working in breakout rooms in a little bit and are happy to kind of bring those comments and questions into the breakout rooms. So please feel free to put those into the chat so that, while they're fresh in your mind. But thank you, Saili, again, and you're welcome to hang out as long as you can with us. Okay, now I wanted to welcome Linda Blanton to introduce herself and explain a little bit more about what CEDAR is and the work that we're doing here.
So glad to have everyone here today. Yes, I'll keep this very short. CEDAR is a national center. It's located at the University of Florida with partners at the American Institutes of Research and the Council of Chief State School Officers. The mission is there for you to read. I won't do that. CEDAR stands for, so that you know, Collaboration for Effective Educator Development, Accountability, and Reform. Most of us who even work there have a hard time remembering that sometimes. But the CEDAR Center, we work with states, about 25, and California is part of that network. And I am working as a co-lead with Paul Sindelar at University of Florida, who I believe is on. You might scroll down and see who he is. But otherwise, we appreciate everyone's attendance, and CEDAR is bringing some funds into California to help support these efforts. So we look forward to more of these. Thank you.
Thank you. And just so that everybody kind of has a sense of the team that we have here today, you can see the different members, and these are really members of just one group of our Cedar, California team that's working on this critical collaboration series. There's certainly a larger group working on the broader objectives of Cedar in the state. But these are the people who are going to be facilitating our breakout rooms in a little bit as well. And I think as each of us is sharing, I think we'll probably do quick introductions as we go too. Whoops. Okay. So now we wanted to move into just a little bit more kind of panel and debrief. So through this critical collaboration series, part of our goal is to enrich our common understanding of all of these kind of systems of intersecting oppression that Dr. Kulkarni described in terms of Discrit. We really want to talk about how do we kind of leverage opportunities through collaboration across our different partnerships and across our different roles. It can be really easy to get overwhelmed or get trapped in just the examination of the problem without moving toward action. And so we really wanted to take a moment to highlight the ways in which programs are tackling these topics in really practical ways. So in both K-12 and in higher education. So also, I just wanted to kind of point out that each of the webinars in our series will include a portion where participants, in the spirit of that action, participants will be invited to work together to always debrief and talk about those direct implications to our own programs, whether those programs are K-12 or in higher education. So for the first practical example, we actually have a video from two educators because they're teaching right now. They're high school teachers who are teaching synchronous distance learning instruction as we speak. So they were great enough to record. And I'm just going to give a little bit of, because I watched their recording and I wanted to give a little bit more context to who they are and the program that they're describing. We know that co-teaching is becoming more prevalent than ever as an approach to serving students who have IEPs in general education settings. But as we work to expand the use of co-teaching to increase access to both general education settings and the curriculum, we also hope that we can refine co-teaching practices to ensure that teachers are prepared to examine the ways that they might leverage the expertise as co-teachers to also address broader systems of oppression that are impacting their students and their programs. So the teachers who are going to share, their names are Eder Goldbach and Cynthia Avalos. They're teachers at Wish Academy High School, where they co-teach an English class as well as an elective class. And they're actually describing the elective class in their video. This is a class for juniors and seniors, and it's designed for students with and without disabilities to introduce topics around disability studies and to provide a foundation in financial literacy for all students. And it might seem initially like those two things are disconnected, but for students with more extensive needs, transition classes historically in high school have often been self-contained programs that are meant to provide an opportunity to participate in community-based instruction, like navigating public transportation, shopping, and participating in maybe leisure activities in the community. But the class that they've designed really reframed this model to focus on an inclusive approach to both engaging in advocacy for all students and embedding students' IEP goals related to transition into the development of a business. And then they're using that business to generate funds that can be then donated and put back into an organization that supports disability advocacy. So this model addressed the need in the school for more background in disability history and advocacy for all students in line with the Fair Education Act, and also to support a desire among the school community for increased financial literacy and community partnerships for all students. So that's just a little bit of a background. So I'll play their video now.
Hi, everybody. Hello, internet space, or wherever you're watching us from. Welcome. My name is Eder Goldbach. I'm an education specialist at Wish Academy, and this is...
I am Cynthia, and I am a general education, specifically an English teacher at Wish Academy. And I teach RISE.
Yeah, that's right. We both teach. We co-teach RISE, which stands for Respond, Include, Support, and Educate. The main premise, the main idea of our class is to introduce our scholars to some social justice issues. They might not be introduced yet. And because of our mission, our school's mission of inclusion, we discuss ableism and introduce that concept to our kiddos. Now that we're entering our second semester, we're excited that we will be starting our second half of the course, which revolves around business and transition plans. Ms. Cynthia, do you want to talk briefly about the business?
Yeah, so our students will open up their own online business because of COVID. We are a little restricted when it comes to a few ideas, but it will be online and the kids, I'm sure, will enjoy it. But yeah, so they just develop their own business. We come up with a business plan. We talk about funding, and ultimately the goal is to start some sort of business, and whatever profits are made our students will choose an organization that they'll donate those funds to. And yeah, we're just really looking forward to that. It also teaches the kids, like I said, budgeting skills, communication skills, anything that comes along with the business, the business plan.
And that's where, my work as an education specialist, as a special education teacher comes in, and we're going to practice all those skills that you would need in a workplace at the school. Now, ideally, if we were in person, we would run a student store. We would have a CEO, a CFO, a COO, and they would all then assign the students in the classroom various roles. We would have interview meetings. We will have job training opportunities, just kind of create a job experience on campus to give them that kind of exposure. And then also with the transition plan, we have some, we're using some resources that allow us to go into the community to kind of profile local businesses to see what their needs are. And then maybe when we bring that information back, we'll explain it to the kids and see maybe if we can come up with some services that our program can provide them. And then that way we can create partnerships in the community and see where that takes us. We're really excited. This is brand new for us. Who knows where it'll go, but luckily.
We are really looking forward to it, like growing and
Yes.
Developing throughout time for sure.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Goldbach.
No, not at all. Please do. As you might have noticed, we work together in English class as well. We do a lot of team teaching where maybe if Miss Cynthia thinks of something that she wants to interject with, once she reads my kind of body language and tempo, she'll just come on in. And we've been working really well with each other. We've known each other for what, 4 years?
4 years or something
4 years
like that.
plus?
Yeah, but this is like the first year where we've worked together
As teachers.
Teachers, yeah. So I used to be a paraprofessional,
Right?
Yeah, for which I was a paraprofessional for about 6 years. And that's how I actually got to know Mr. Goldbach. And so it's obviously a pleasure, and just we somehow have like this really good camaraderie, which is great.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
as most of you know, you need that in this field, So yeah, please reach out to us if you have any questions. My email, or maybe Dr. Hanratty can give it to you after, egoldbach, EGOLDBACH @wishcharter.org. Please send me out any feelers, anything at all. I'll be glad to talk to you and answer any questions you might have.
And my email is cavalos@wishcharter.org. So cavalos@wishcharter.org. And again, just email me if you have any questions or anything at all. I can provide some advice. I don't know.
Yeah, and we will see you later.
Yeah, bye. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
You can see those teachers are ready to answer any and all questions. So, but that class that they're focusing on are really, they're doing their best as like K-12 educators to try to take these concepts of critical disability studies and bring them down to the level of translating them to what does it mean in terms of action for the students. And they're really, as high school teachers of juniors and seniors, really thinking about how can they embed these ideas in ways that'll support continued advocacy and engagement even beyond their class and beyond high school and into the community. So then I think we wanted to invite Rebecca Jez to talk a little bit about the program at her university.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Jez. Thank you, Amy. So at University of San Diego, we have a dual credential program. And one of the things that we intentionally decided to do was model co-teaching and collaboration for our students and for our program as we developed it and then also got it off the ground. And there was a lot of lessons that we have learned. We had two assistant professors who worked together very well in a team, and they learned from each other, and then they used that information to continue to grow and develop their own skills. And then I also worked with adjunct and another full-time professor in a course where we also really looked at how we could develop it and improve it together. Two of the lessons that we learned, one was on buy-in, the importance of buy-in. And that's really important because we have to think about how we can do things differently. And so a lot of the discussions that we had was the idea that we didn't want to take the additive approach from Binks and Banks of just adding something to a course that was already there, but really dismantling the course and then rebuilding it with the skills of the instructors and also with the best practices and evidence-based practices that we knew teachers would benefit from in the field. The other thing is capacity. We are with COVID, a lot of, and the move to online teaching, we realized that everybody is kind of at the, working at a higher level and having to learn a lot of new skills and move things online. And so really thinking about how we could do that and do that in a way that supported each other's strengths and then also addressed some of the needs that needed to happen when we were online. So we did that with creating videos and kind of flipping the classrooms. And then also really at this time with the Black Lives Matter movement, we also, and prior to that as well, we were really challenging what it means to be a predominantly white institution and how we can, become more of a transformative institution and challenge some of the things that we have done in the past that we had gotten used to. And so we're in the process of still continuing to do that and growing within our program and within ourselves individually. So.
Thank you. I'm looking at the time, and so I think I'm just going to super quickly just kind of give an example from Cal State Northridge also, and then move us along. I think that just an example from CSUN or a launch teacher prep program, and one of the things we were talking about before this webinar started was just we're definitely in the process of change in terms of increasing collaboration across our separate departments. We have historically had separate departments for elementary education, secondary education, special education, and school psych and counseling, leadership, and I think that one of the things we're working on is creating more opportunities for cross-department collaboration in the ways in which we're preparing our teachers, and we're doing that from both kind of a top-down in the sense that we have a committee that is looking at equity and faculty affairs kind of issues and creating spaces for dialogue across our departments. So we have monthly or several times a semester, maybe not quite monthly, social justice dialogues that are really looking at what are some of these issues that relate to our students and our role as teacher educators around equity, anti-racism, anti-ableism, and how can we kind of work collectively as a faculty, even when we're working in those separate departments, to kind of address these topics or these issues together. But then we also have kind of the bottom-up approach happening, where faculty across departments are then kind of designing some alliances, and we have this in several different areas where then we're working kind of on creating co-taught courses that do leverage that expertise that Rebecca was talking about. So I think that we're not nearly as fully integrated as Rebecca's program, but I think that we are. I just wanted to share a little bit about that process of working towards that change. Okay, but I am gonna move us forward in the interest of time. Whoops. Oh. Okay. So then we wanted to invite Lynn to share a little bit about this Blackboard course and how you can get access to additional materials.
Hi everyone, my name is Lynn Larson. I'm from Braman University. Thank you so much for attending today. We have an opportunity for you to work with others in your institution to do some critical dialogue, and we've provided a Blackboard course site to facilitate that process. We also have an opportunity, if you participate in our activities on the Blackboard course site, to be put into a drawing for an Amazon gift card to acknowledge the work that you're doing. So the link for the Blackboard course site is there in the chat as well. You should be able to go there and create an account. You will need to create a different account if you have an institutional Blackboard account. This is Blackboard course sites, which is a different part of Blackboard. So just be aware of that. You won't be able to use your regular Blackboard log on. And once you get into the course, there will be a folder for each of the workshops in this series. And you'll be able to click on workshop number 1. You'll see the title of it, Critical Collaboration Workshop number 1, and our speaker from today. And once you click inside that folder, you will see the intersectionality graphic, which we're going to be talking about in our small groups in just a moment. And then workshop number 1, the assignment is an action plan. There's a framework for you to, again, work with people at your institution to think through the topics of today and how they may apply to your institution, and to think about what work may need to be done in this area with your institution. And so we have laid out the action plan for you there. And then we also have just a brief discussion prompt that you can, online discussion, just like we do with so many of our students. There's an opportunity for us as a group to have some interaction as well. So we would love for you to sign up for this. It's not a requirement, but it does help facilitate the conversations that we would like for you to have at your institution.
So, and it's certainly helpful if anybody wants to go ahead and click on that link now and get yourself logged in, then it will be helpful for our small groups.
All right, so for the small groups, what we've done is created our action plan, which is 2 pages long. And the first part is where we came up with, we wanted to show you the intersectionality and positionality visual that we've put on there, where we can use some time to talk about that. And then also really look at how we are seeing intersectionality within our different organizations and communities that we're serving. And then we have just the terms anti-racist, anti-ableist, and affirming from the presentation that we hope to have some dialogue around. If you go to the next slide, the next page is the action plan that you can submit, and then we have 20 $50 gift cards available from a drawing for all of those that are submitted by the 30th of this month. And basically we want you to do a site description, think about the challenges and barriers to collaborative spaces, some assets-based solutions to affirm collaborative spaces. and then what next steps that you and your institution can do, and then provide some evidence of you, you know, either your plan or an idea that you have for kind of moving your institution forward. We highly recommend you work with other people at your institute to create this plan. So if you, you know, for example, I'm from University of San Diego, I see at least 3 people when I scan through from my institution. And if we had worked on this together, we could submit, each one of us could submit this in Blackboard, and then we would be submitted into the drawing.
Yeah, so each person who submits is eligible, even if you're from the same group.
And you could submit the same document. From,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
More people equals more chances. So I think that next we are going to move into our breakout rooms. The facilitators are listed there, and the discussion prompt is really what Rebecca just described. We're reflecting on the speakers and working on reviewing the action plan. We won't be coming back to the main session, so you can leave directly from the breakout room, and I think your facilitator will just give any reminders or wrap-ups at the end. So I think you can go ahead and accept the invitation if you're getting it.